Hello, I'm Tom Harmer, your town manager. Thank you for joining me for this edition of Talk of the Town. Today I'm on the very north end of the island, known as Beer Can Island or Greer Island, and it's a very natural setting here. It's also a county park, so the county is actually the owner of this property, but it's within the jurisdictional limits of the town, and so there's a partnership with Manatee County. This is an area that requires a lot of attention by the town from a beach nourishment standpoint. So we're going to talk today about a current beach nourishment and shoreline protection project that we're working on as part of the overall nourishment efforts on the island. So Charlie Mopps, our senior project manager, is going to join me for that discussion. Hey Charlie, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Very good.
Nice to see you again, Tom.
Obviously a frequent guest on Talk of the Town, overseeing multiple projects on the island. We've talked about other projects, including our overall beach project, but today I want to talk about Greer Island, the shoreline protection, the structures that are going to be installed, the sand that's going to come in. Before we do that first though, obviously Greer Island is a beautiful natural area, and we can see just where we're at now. You have some of the trees and the canopy and the shade area back off of the shoreline. We have some of the dead trees and some of the driftwood that's kind of developed over time. I know the public has been concerned about losing all of that with this current project, and I know you guys have been very sensitive to that. So can you talk a little about the parameters of the project and what areas will not be impacted?
Okay. Well, about where we're standing, we're probably 50 feet or so north of where the tie-in of the beach will happen. So the tie-in of the beach will happen right about where this dead vegetation is here. So anything northeast of here will not be touched. So we have this big area where a lot of people like to come and recreate, and there's a lot of early morning filming, and people like to come out here and take pictures of the birds and themselves. So it's that whole area will remain in place as is.
So there will be this natural area on the island, even to the shoreline in this particular location, where that's going to stay for people to take pictures, the photographers, etc. And this is not impacted by the current project.
That is correct. That is not impacted by the current project.
Okay. So high level, what's going to happen on the north end of the island?
Okay, so high level is we're going to be placing 3 groins on the very north section, which would be the Beer Can Island, Greer Island section that you mentioned earlier. And with that, they're going to be very low profile. So a lot of people have asked me, like, am I going to see these rocks sticking out? And that's not something you're going to see, because the rock groins are going to be elevated at only 3 feet. And then the beach fill that goes on top of that is elevated to 5 feet. So all but just the very ends will be covered by beach. And what those are there for is to really protect this part of the island. As you know, Tom, we've done a lot of beach nourishment projects in the very north part of the island, including one just very recently. And then you have storm events and all that sand ends up here. And so if you go back in time on Google Earth, you can actually see that there was no spit in Greer Island. And that spit just has been growing and growing and growing. So to prevent that, that's why we're doing the high level project of putting in the groins and then backfilling it with the sand. And that will hopefully those things will lock that sand into place for a longer period of time.
And I've heard our coastal engineer and I've heard you say that this is the most erosional part of the island.
Correct. Besides the spot that we visited earlier, which was Gulfside Road, this is our most erosional hotspot on the entire island.
And as I understand it, the pass is right here, so you get the currents that draw the sand into the pass, but you also have at some point where there's a deflection or an area where the sand starts to go to the south.
Correct. Typically on the west coast of Florida, sand travels through the coastal processes from north to south. However, right here on this part of the island, the sand wants to go in both directions. So because the sand wants to go in both directions, that's why this is such an erosional hotspot.
And so we have 2 groins in the area now that were put in years ago. This project, as you mentioned, there's going to be 3 groins that we call the north N1, 2, and 3, north 1, 2, and 3, and then 2 southern groins. And all 5 of them, are they all rock groins?
The 5 that we're placing in now are rock groins, and they're here to supplement the 2 PAGs, the concrete groins that are currently out there.
Okay, and those groins that were put in you refer to them as PAGs. They're adjustable groins.
They are adjustable, but they're adjusted to the most, they're adjusted to the point where they're holding the most sand by their design. You know, these are designed to actually hold more sand in place than those.
And the rock groins, there's actually a bit of science and engineering to this, where the size of the rocks and how closely they're placed is all a factor and relates to how tight they are and how much sand might flow.
Correct, because these are still considered semi-permeable groins, so it does allow for natural sand transport to still happen, but at a much reduced rate.
One of the things I do want to mention, because I mentioned earlier about the partnership with Manatee County, because this park, this property, Greer Island, is owned by Manatee County, but it's in the town limits. But for this particular project, Manatee County contributed financially for these groins
The
and
north
the
two
sand.
groins.
Yeah.
N3 and N2 were financially contributed to the tune of $2.6 million.
Yeah, so $2.69 million, they're attaching and they're being placed on and attached to the county property, and they're helping maintain this island as well as part of that, as they protect the northern end and the structures, our residents, and help minimize the amount of sand that goes around into the spit that was developed over the years.
And you know, you're bringing up a lot of really good valid points, because you know, you talked about the really nice natural area that you have just behind you. If we did nothing and allowed this island to keep migrating, or this spit to keep migrating landward, all of these trees would be falling into the water at some point.
And we can see, we've seen during storms that you actually have washovers.
Yes.
That it washes over the island and actually puts sand and water into the lagoon area. Correct. And kills a lot of the vegetation. That's why you see a lot of this older dead vegetation.
And as a matter of fact, those washovers are also killing the vegetation that exists inside that lagoon. The seagrasses that the manatees like to go in and feed on have been, you know, not completely, but they've been really impacted by sand being intruded into the lagoon just from those washovers.
No, very good. So what I'd like to do is we'll finish up this segment by going over and just taking a look at the actual groin project where they're starting this first groin, N3.
Correct.
And you can kind of point out some of the components to that as they move forward with that work.
No problem.
All right, great, let's go.
So Tom, this is like the landward side of N3, as you mentioned earlier. And as you can see, what they're doing is they're placing, but they're, like you talked about earlier, the engineering behind it, they're not just dropping the rocks, they're actually placing the rocks strategically so that they do hold the most sand as they're designed to do.
So they kind of piece them in strategically for a certain tightness.
Correct. It's kind of like playing Tetris with really big stones.
Well, and I noticed as we were coming around, there's actually some type of fabric and base that was put in first, and then the rocks were placed on top of that.
Right, if you walk this way a little bit, you could see out there in the ocean or in the Gulf, that black, that is the mattresses. They're rock-filled mattresses, and they're made out of a geofabric with smaller stones inside of them. Because as you know, if I went and just put a bunch of rocks out there, just wave action is going to dig those rocks in, and then they're going to disappear. So you have to create a foundation for those rocks to sit on, and those are those mattresses that you mentioned.
Okay, so that shadow out there, I assume that's like the end, or what we would call, say, the T.
That's the T head of the
groin structure.
That is correct.
So they've placed the mattresses out there now, and then there'll be that mattress that runs all the way out from here to the T, and they'll place these rocks on it.
That is correct. And because of earlier storm events, and we've had a lot of fronts come through, instead of just working from waterward, the contractor decided, hey, let me start pulling some landward work in, tie in the landward piece, and then I can tie both sections together. And every time they put these stones out, they're also coming out here with the survey crews, and they're surveying and to make sure that the mattresses and the stones are in the right place.
Okay. And you talked about earlier, the height of this groin it's really not a high profile, it's a low profile groin. So when we look at it now, how much higher will it be built up?
Okay, so my estimate on that would be that the yellow line that you see there is probably the 3-foot elevation. That 3-foot elevation, so once they get all the rocks built on top of that and they all meet that 3-foot elevation by about a 20-foot wide top and a 40-foot wide bottom, and it'll go all the way out, But then when we backfill this with 5 feet of sand, that will be covered by 2 foot of sand.
Okay. And so it's 20 foot wide on the top of
Typically
the groin.
speaking, yes.
Yeah, generally, typically
Yes.
speaking. All right, and so in addition to the groins, this is the first one being built, and it's the most northern, and there'll be 2 more here, and then 2 more after that on the south side. Then sand is brought in.
Correct. So right now, from now until about June, they're going to just be doing the construction of the groins. And then by then, Weeks will be done doing our filling of segment 2 and segment 3, and then they'll come up here and start backfilling this area with that same sand.
Okay, and so this is the sand that comes from Passage Key.
That is correct.
Okay, they're pulling it up out of Passage Key, they're barging it down here, and they'll be placing it in between all the groins.
That is correct.
And like you said, it's going to top over the groins.
Right.
And it's also, how far out is it going to go?
It goes out quite far. Like if you see the T-head, so when people come out and they visit this area, they'll see the T-head. Right about to where you see the T-head is where the slope or the tail end of the fill goes.
So that's a significant amount of sand.
there's a significant amount of beach.
Yes.
You know, so what you'll only see is just the ends of the groins.
Yes. Well, and it's interesting because one of the concerns we've heard is that this area has been all cleared out, and they're concerned what it's going to look like at the end. And in this area, it's going to look different because this is a protection project, a shoreline protection project for the island and the town and the residents that live on this end. But you were sharing with me a pre-Tropical Storm Eta aerial that showed that this area actually was cleared out not by the work, it was cleared out by that tropical storm, and that's what we've seen. We've seen the dieback occur, we've seen the trees knocked over, and in this case it actually washed through into the lagoon and cleared out this entire area.
Right, and we've kind of mentioned that earlier with the lagoon being affected by the seagrasses. Right where we're standing, the seagrasses used to come almost all the way up to the shoreline, and this sand has just been migrating into the lagoon, and it's been topping those seagrasses, so it's been killing those beds.
Yeah. So as you're working with sand from Passage Key, because that's what's going to be placed here, right. I know our residents get very concerned about the quality of the sand. So can you talk a little bit about Passage Key sand?
It's wonderful. As a matter of fact, prior to us approving the project, you had me go dive on Passage Key to bring up samples. We brought it back. It is white, fine sand with nice black specks in it, and it just has the right amount of shell marl in there to end up holding that sand onto the beach for a longer period of time.
And there's, they grade sand out, and there's a lot of different components to it. And so the previous major nourishment project was a trucking project for the town back in, I think 2016.
That is correct.
And that sand was from the middle of the state, and it was brought in and kind of picked out color and whatnot. Here, this sand that we're using for all of this work is coming from the Gulf or from the pass.
Correct.
So it's sand that's coming and has been back and forth in the beach in different ways.
And it has been, and that's a great point. And it's going to look very similar to that boutique truck haul sand that we brought in. And here's the big difference. That sand was $60 per cubic yard. We're getting this for about 30.
Yeah, very good. Well, great. Well, thanks again. Great job for managing this project.
My pleasure.
I want to thank our residents and our visitors for their patience between March and August. There's going to be a lot of work going on, but it's really going to help us maintain that high quality of life and the high expectations on our beach conditions for Longboat Key for a number of years. And we always appreciate you taking the time to learn more about what we're doing here on the island. So thank you for joining us today for this edition of Talk of the Town.